Okay, so in this section of the tutorial, we're going to animate the brand name as well. This is probably, aside from the logo, it's definitely the most important part of the animation because obviously it gives the brand recognition factor. You'll remember from the earlier one that we actually we had a version of it where it's all in one. So we could do the same thing we did with the logo and have a wipe here. We could even utilize the same weight of white and timing. But we're not going to do that in here. What we want to do instead is we want to animate each of these individually. Now we could go through and manually and edit the front and back of each of these elements. But what I'm going to show you is a little trick that will help us distribute these layers over time without having to sort of hand tweak each one. So I've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers here. If I had to sort of go in and set the duration of each one and then manually drag them, it's going to take me a little bit of time. So I'm going to find a shortcut for that. So I want to space these out basically across time. So I've hidden the Acumen layer altogether. You could delete it. I'm just going to leave it there in case. And I've got the A selected at the moment, layer A selected. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and hit the N to select all. Okay. I've got the playback head at the beginning where they all pop onto the count. So on my animation, that's at 5 frames. And I'm going to hit the page down button. Now, if you're using a laptop, sometimes you might need to use a function modifier key, or if you've got an external keyboard, you might want to plug that in. It makes it a lot easier. So I'm going to hit the page down button on my keyboard and count. And I'm going to count, I want to move maybe 8 frames per letter. Okay, so if I hit 1, that's 1 frame, 2, that's 2 frames, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you can see up here that it's telling me, I could also type it in to jump to it, but I'm basically at 8 frames after 5 seconds. Okay, and then if you remember earlier, we used a trick to snap the length, the last frame of the selected objects to the playback head. So we used the Alt and right square bracket key, which basically trims all of those layers to finish at the place where the playback head is. So in other words, each of these now lasts 8 seconds and then disappears. So I'll go back to the beginning like this. I've still got all the layers selected, and I'm going to ask After Effects to help me out by going up to Animation, down to Keyframe Assistant, and the option to Sequence Layers. What this does is say, basically, After Effects, do me a favor, take all of those layers I've currently selected and put them in order. Now, the order you select them will affect it. Okay, so I'll just demo this first. Deselect if it's selected overlap. I know it looks odd, it looks like we're not doing anything, but it's going to do it anyway. Overlap is, it will make them overlap by so many seconds. I'm just going to leave that. We'll do that manually if we need to. So I'm going to hit OK, and you can see that it's stacked them. Now it happens to be that because I selected A and then went to K-U-M-E-N with the Shift key to the N, it's done them in the correct order. Okay, I'm just going to undo. Okay, we'll go back to this stage where we hadn't organized them, and let's show you what would happen if I deselect and then hold down Control and select them in a different random order. So say I wanted them to be spaced out but not in order, I can select them with a random order using Control, use the same trick, and they will now be stacked but in that random order. So whatever order you organize them is going to be the order they're going to be stacked. I'm going to undo again, and I'll go back to how we had it at the beginning by holding down Shift. But it's important that you understand that what After Effects is doing is based on your selection. So the order you select them. So I started with A, held down Shift and went to N, which selects all the intermediate layers in sequence. I'm now going to sequence those layers. I have to trim them first. If I'd left them all this long, those other layers would disappear. So if you suddenly find that all yours have gone, it's because you haven't trimmed them to 8 frames, and therefore they're stacking one after the other going off the end of the composition. Don't select overlap in this instance. And there we go. So what we have is we should have it go through one letter at a time. The downside is that obviously they're not hanging about. So we don't, if we've got a very good visual memory, we might be able to spell out the brand. That's not the effect I'm after. So, but it is around about the right kind of timing in terms of them arriving. So we're going to drag to the end of the timeline. I've still got the same layers selected, and we're going to use the same Alt right bracket shortcut to again extend those now so they endure till the end of the clip. So now it appears to come in. So the reason we had to trim them first is so that when they stack, they spaced out evenly, they don't go off the end of the composition. And then at the end, we're just making them extend so they don't disappear. I'll just let this cycle through so we can see now that we have them a bit like a typewriter effect. Okay, so that's how we can get After Effects to pace out layers if we wanted the paced delivery. Now, there's nothing to stop me going in and deciding that certain layers maybe you want longer or not. But for the purposes of demoing again, I like getting Illustrator to help you lay out spacing and timing of things. That's fine. Now, I'm not terribly happy with them. Again, I don't want this sort of almost terminal typewriter look for this particular animation. I want this to be a little smoother. So I've still got all of those layers selected. And what we're going to do is we're just going to put a fade on each one as well, so it's a little bit softer. So I'm going to affect the opacity. So I'm going to bring up the transparency or opacity. Now, in After Effects, kind of confusingly, it is called opacity, but the shortcut is T for transparency. So with those layers selected, if I hit T on my keyboard, you can see that I get an opacity slider. Now, like we did before when we tweened that shape for the mask, we're going to go in a bit to a point. I'm going to go past the last one to come in, and this is going to put them all in the same place, which is not quite what I want, but I'll then adjust them. If I were to try and I could do them one at a time, but again, for the sake of speed and making sure they're all consistent and come in over a certain time, I'm just going to do this in one lot. So my last one comes in at about 6 seconds, 15 frames, and ends, in this case, where I've dragged it to. So it's about a 1 second duration that I'm putting the fade on. So I'm going to hit my stopwatch with all of them selected. That should activate the stopwatch and insert a keyframe on all of my Acumen individual layers. And then I'm going to come down, move back, because obviously they're 100% opaque, move back to the beginning where the last letter came in, and I'm going to dial down to 0. So what that's going to do, as you'll see, is at the moment they're being laid out, but they're hidden. But when they hit that, they're going to fade in nicely like so. Okay. So final thing to do is I'm going to click and drag over all of my keyframes on those layers, being careful not to select any of the layers on top and bottom. So you can see I've just got the AKUMEN and both sets here. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose an option under my keyframe assistant called Easy Ease. What this will do is instead of them going from 0 straight to 100 in a straight line, it's going to make them slowly come in and then fade as they get towards 100. So it's just smoothing that transition. It looks easier on the eye. So I'm going to put that on. And you can see that the keyframes have changed their shape to show that these are now Easy Ease frames. So that transition, rather than just being kind of feeling a bit abrupt at both ends, almost can't see the start and end. It's just more tapered. Okay. To see what that really looks like, and just for further information, there is a thing called the graph editor. And you can see that instead of it starting at 0 and going in a straight line straight up here, because the eye is not very good at linear progressions like that, what it's done is it's bent out this curve. So if you wanted to, you could edit that curve to make it slower to come in at the beginning, or have the transition quicker. So these are, the sort of keyframes, and this is a graph view, which allows me to change the relationship of what's going to happen here is going to be a bit slow, then it's going to go really quick, then it's going to slow off again. So I can see what that's like, so we can always edit that transition. And when I'm happy with it, I'm just going to hide the graph. Now you don't have to mess with the graph. 9 times out of 10, the standard Easy Ease stuff works beautifully. Excuse me, I selected a layer rather than the keyframe. So I'm just dragging over all the keyframes again. And what I'm going to do now is just deselect, and I'm going to position the other keyframes appropriately. So I'm going to drag these out. So layer by layer, rather than having them come in but be hidden, they're going to fade in. So I just need to sort of layer by layer. So in this case, I'm on the U layer. I'm going to grab them and drag them to the start of the U layer. This will be the K layer, so that they will stagger in, be staggered like they were originally, but because we created the animation, the sort of softening, the smoothing and what have you. So now you can see they come in, but rather than being punched, there is a subtle fade. Now I could make it a lot slower to make that fade much more subtle, but I'm relatively happy with that. It doesn't jar on my eye, and you're kind of getting that reveal over time. Okay, so I can hold down Shift, click on the A layer, hold down Shift, click on the N, and I can hit the T key to hide the opacity. Okay, so you can use T to show and hide, in this case, opacity. T for transparency. Okay, it's a little confusing because they use the term transform for a lot of these things as well. So while we're here, we've now got our wipe going right across both and the trademark. We then got the Acumen brand slowly dollying in. Now we could spread that out if we wanted it to be a bit slower. And then at the end, we've got quite a long time before performance air. Okay, so we could go in and stagger that if we wanted. We don't have to stick to 8 frames. We could also move these across. So like we did before, we could move them so there's actually a gap. If I select the K layer, in fact, let's select all of them below the A layer and use the page down button. No, I won't bother. I'll just leave it where it is. We'll stretch them out in a minute. I'll show you a different technique for that. Much easier than manually doing it and guessing whether they're right. What we'll do is space it over time. So final thing to sort out, we've got this kind of coming in. It's going to pause for a minute so you kind of see the brand. We're going to leave a bigger gap, and then we've got performance air. So again, we could with performance air, we could animate it, we could put a wipe on it. I'm just going to have it fade in just for simplicity's sake. But what I'm going to do is bring it slightly forward. So I'm going to click on the front with the strapline layer selected. I'm just going to drag it forward till about 8 seconds. Put the playhead there. Check we've got it in the right spot. Okay, and I'm going to give it a 1 second fade in. So again, we're going to, with that strapline layer selected, we're going to hit the T key for opacity. We're going to hit the stopwatch, telling it to insert a keyframe and keep an eye on the opacity. We're going to come to the beginning and we're going to dial that opacity down to 0. And we're going to get that nice, slow fade in for performance air. If we wanted to make it last longer, we could drag this keyframe later on. The other thing to bear in mind when you're working with keyframes, I'll just mention now, you get the little keyframe symbol here to add, but you can see when I'm on a layer that has a keyframe, like here, that is highlighted, and I get these arrows which show me I can go to the next. So if I wanted to change as well, let's say I was getting this thing not only to fade in, but maybe to raise up from the bottom of the page, rather than having loads of different keyframes at different points, quite often it's a good idea to use existing keyframes as your point. So here, for example, if that's the finishing position, let's say I'll just animate it for the moment. So I'll hit P for position and I'll put a keyframe in there. So what we can do is actually toggle open this so we can see the position and the opacity at the same time. And I might want my movement to start at the same point. So I go using my opacity layer, jump to my previous keyframe. Now I can go to my position and I could, for example, put it off here. So what that's going to do now is it's going to come up and fade and then slowly fall into position. Again, I haven't got any, there's no smoothness to that transition. It's just going to stop fairly abruptly. So I might want to select these, right click, and also go for that easy ease option, which is going to give it just a little bit of finesse. Okay, so we can sort of see that element coming in at the end. Now in this case, I don't like the position thing, so I'm actually going to, I don't want it moving. I'm just going to delete. Okay, so you can always try things. If you don't like them, you can always undo or delete the bits you don't like. So I'm just going to scrub back to the beginning, hit the play. Clearly I've got a problem with that strapline now. Yeah, okay, just to undo, I've clearly messed it up. So position, where are we? So just to undo, bring them back. I'm going to take these out. That's my starting one. That's the one I want to delete, so that it'll be in the right place. Okay, now I can delete this one, or just take off the stopwatch. I'm not changing the position at all. Excuse me. So there we go. Okay, so there we go. We have everything coming in, and then the strapline at the end. And then it's going to just abruptly stop and start with a black screen. Again, final touch might be to come in to here, maybe a little bit further on, around about here, and I'm going to select all of my layers, and I'm going to go to opacity, and I'm going to keyframe all of them, and I'm going to go to the end, and I'm going to turn the opacity right down to 0, and that should just give me a fade at the end of my animation. The whole lot should fade off. Okay, let's just try that. So everything's going to come in. Ooh. Some of mine are animating out a bit quicker. It didn't put a transition in for some bizarre reason for those layers, so let's just jump to here, and you can see down here it didn't add transitions for these layers, so I just need to select them. Not sure why it didn't, and the strap line too, and we want to put a keyframe in here, and we want to dial these all up to 100 at this point, and then we jump to the end. It's probably because they're easy ease or something like that. I don't know, maybe I didn't select all the layers correctly or something. Okay, scrub back to the beginning. Let's select everything. Hit T to hide the transparency, deselect. Let's play that animation. So we have the wipe going across the two shapes and that. I'd probably want to refine my timing a little bit now, but from the purposes of this, it just demonstrates that purpose, that whole kind of process of bringing in elements, animating the different elements, etc. So I'm kind of relatively okay with that. We'll come back with one more tutorial showing how you can refine the timing without having to manually adjust all of it. So I'll show you that in a second. But you can see here we've brought in an an Illustrator file. We've animated it across After Effects to have a number of different effects, but not overdone it. We don't want to throw too much. It's only a logo at the end of the day. We want to refine the timing perhaps, but we're pretty much getting ready. You know, this could be ready if we were happy with the timing, ready for export, putting into Lottie, and applying to our apps, prototypes, etc.